Okay, welcome back, everyone. I have just a couple of announcements. First, I'm sorry about the problem with the website. I did think I'd posted questions, and we made a step forward where you actually can see the documents I've posted on the website, but you still can't see the questions. So thank you for reminding me of this, and I will work on this problem tomorrow as I encounter the 21st century. Second, Pauline Meyer, this Thursday at 5:15 at the Mass Historical Society, 1154 Boylston Street. It's a seminar series they have for people interested in the early Republic, and she'll be talking about the chapters of her book on the Massachusetts ratification process. She's writing what will be the definitive book on the ratification of the Constitution. So that's this Thursday, 5:15, and third, I generally arrive here at about 7, quarter to 7, and I sit in Robinson Hall, which is a building kind of adjacent to Seaver Hall. And if you have any reason to want to come talk to me, that would be, a good place to find me. There's a conference room on the ground floor at the end of the hallway, and I generally am sitting there trying to figure out what I am going to say when we come into class. So if you have any ideas about that, it'll be a good opportunity too. So that's where you usually can find me. Otherwise, just keep doing what you're doing, which is to email me, call me, track me down on the T, and if you have any reason to want to talk. Okay? Any questions since? Okay, good. Then what we'll do tonight is conclude with the Constitutional Convention, which we were in the middle of last time. And after the convention had worked out these, the big problem of small states, big states, they turned their attention to, and they had basically the structure of the federal government in mind or in form with a list of Congress's powers, pretty much as you'll find it in Article 1, Section 8, which does define the powers of Congress. By far the longest section of the Constitution. They turned their attention to other issues that had been put aside, and one was the election of the president. As you'll recall, the initial proposal was for the national legislature to choose the president who would serve for actually a one limited term. I think it was 7 years. And no one was really happy with this, having the legislature choose the president, because that would, of course, make him dependent on the legislature, and they wanted him to be independent of the legislature. They wanted him to be able to check the legislature, which is why he has a veto. And so they didn't like that form or that system, but they couldn't think of a better way to do it. Would it have been possible in 1787 to have a national election? I'm a little dubious about that. Would the smaller states have wanted a national executive chosen simply by a popular vote? Probably not. You remember what a fuss they made over having population represented in the legislature. So would they have wanted a president chosen simply by a popular vote, which would give a couple of the big states, a direct choice? Would it have been possible for there to be one or two candidates known throughout the country? Remember, this is at a time when the country extended along the eastern seaboard, these 13 states, but it would take a good amount of time to get from Georgia to Massachusetts, or vice versa, if you were in Massachusetts, had a reason to go to Georgia, which incidentally people did. But, communications were slow, difficult. Would people in one state have been aware of some great guy in another state who should be president? Probably not. So what would you have proposed? And what the framers proposed was an interesting system, the Electoral College. And let me just say in the offset, I like the Electoral College. I will oppose with my dying breath any attempts to change it for reasons we can talk about later on, since I'm not here to proselytize and tell you what a great system this is. Although, frankly, this is the first election in recent memory in which we haven't heard incessant carping about the Electoral College being a terrible thing. That's a subject for another day. The purpose of the Electoral College is not to deprive you folks of the choice of president. It is to deprive the legislature of a choice of president. It is to take the power of choosing the president away from the national legislature, also away from the state legislatures. Put it in the hands of independent electors who will be chosen in each state, and they will meet on the same day in each state capital. And the reason for that is to make it difficult for a foreign interest to bribe them all. Someone would have to travel, to Georgia, to Massachusetts, all of these different places, and find these individuals if they wanted some sort of intrigue. And the framers had examples of intrigue among bodies of electors who got together to choose an executive officer. For example, in Poland, the Polish king was elected, and the election of a Polish king was dominated by the agents of Russia or Germany or Austria, who all had, an interest in who would be king of Poland. So you put the election or the electors in each state capital on the same day to mitigate the possibility of bribery or other kinds of intrigue. Also, with the expectation that the electors from Massachusetts are all going to vote for someone from Massachusetts, unless you would have 13 different sets of electoral votes for 13 different individuals. They require each elector to vote for 2 people, one of whom has to be from another state. So you require the electors to vote for 2 people. One, their second choice will be from another state. Now, the framers did not anticipate that these electors, incidentally, each state would have the same number of electors as they would have members of the House of Representatives plus 2 senators. So that means Delaware, which is going to have 1 representative, actually will have 3 electoral votes, which makes them a little happier. If Massachusetts has 8 electoral votes, it means they have 10 votes for president. Okay. The framers anticipated that once these electors had voted, there would not be a single candidate who had a majority. Instead, it was likely there would be 3, 4, 5 individuals who might have a significant number of votes because they might have been people well known, say, in New England or in Virginia, and maybe it attracted support from Maryland or Pennsylvania. That is, they thought there would be regional blocs which would then be proposing candidates. So what the framers anticipated was no single candidate having a majority of the electoral vote. So what happens then? The House of Representatives will choose from among these candidates. Each state will have 1 vote. So the way the framers imagined this system would work is the electors would function as a nominating board. They would produce candidates. You can imagine another alternative would be for Congress itself to generate candidates. This takes that choice out of Congress, although Congress, the House of Representatives, will have the final choice with each state having 1 vote. Okay? And because you're going to have, 1 person is going to become president, they said, okay, the person who gets the second highest number of votes will be vice president. That means you're not going to have this disaffected runner-up running around the country saying, if I only gotten 2 more votes, it was because of bribery in Delaware or somewhere, I am not president, running around the country causing trouble because he would have been a better choice, which is, I suppose, what he had been saying during the campaign. So you have this electoral college system, which the framers did not imagine it would function the way it does now. They imagined the electors would propose candidates, the Congress would choose from among them, and because you have this complicated system with everyone voting for 2 people, they have to create something for the number 2 guy to do. That's why they create the office of vice president. If you read the Constitution carefully, you'll know there's precious little for the vice president to do other than preside over the Senate. They thought he would be relatively harmless there. And we'll get into this later on. So this rather complicated system gives the states a role in choosing the president, while the representatives of the people as a whole in the House of Representatives have the final choice. And it is, again, as Oliver Ellsworth said, partly federal, partly national. That is, the states proposing candidates, this national legislature making the choice. And again, though it's federal, since each state has one vote when the Congress is choosing the president. Now, the system only worked the way the framers thought it would once, and that was in 1824. There were 4 different candidates. No one had a majority. Each one represented a different region, so the House of Representatives chose from among them. Only twice in our history has the House of Representatives made a choice for president. In 1824 was the time it worked just the way the framers imagined it would. Not many of the framers were around to admire their handiwork in 1824. Somewhere in 1800, the other time it worked that way. It's an issue we'll talk about later on. But that was a different story. Okay? Any questions on this? The Electoral College, why we should keep it? You all now know. Okay. It was brought to my attention, this whole issue of lots of different issues are brought up with the Electoral College. Some of you may have brought them up in your day. Anyone here not hate the Electoral College, think it should be abolished, other than Ethan? Okay. Good. Obviously, I tipped my hand. I told you I like it. Now everyone says, oh, we have to like the Electoral College, too. My father was at one time a member of the New Hampshire legislature. You know, in New Hampshire, I think everyone takes a turn being in the legislature because it's like 500 people and it doesn't pay anything. And he got an impassioned letter in 1991 from a member of the United States Senate, actually a senator from Arkansas. And he wrote to every member of the New Hampshire legislature urging them to start the process of abolishing the Electoral College because it was inherently unfair to people from small states like New Hampshire and like Arkansas. So unless it was abolished, no one from either of these states could ever be president. And it turns out the senator from Arkansas's good friend, the governor of Arkansas, wanted to be president, but because of the Electoral College, he couldn't do it, so it should be abolished. You know, it's the kind of argument that history makes us look at with a jaundiced eye. So, anyway, I apologize. I didn't mean to interject my own personal views into this course. So, another issue arises toward the end of the convention, and that's the issue of slavery. And it comes up in an interesting way. During a debate on Congress's power to pass navigation acts, that is, laws regulating navigation or taxing commerce. You'll remember the whole revolution was brought into being by an argument over Parliament's power to tax commerce or regulate trade, and now there's a question about Congress's power to regulate trade. And you'll recall this Constitutional Convention had been brought into being partly because of conflicts over who can regulate trade in Chesapeake Bay and other places. George Mason, who was, in addition to being a great statesman and a great constitutional thinker, was also a tobacco planter. And he recognized that the interests of tobacco planters quite likely would be subverted to the interests of guys who own ships in the carrying trade. There would be a majority in Congress probably more beholden or more involved with international trade than with raising tobacco for export. So Mason wanted to protect the rights of tobacco planters by requiring a 2/3 vote of Congress to pass a navigation law, a law taxing exports or imports. He recognized tobacco planters would be in a minority, as would other people who produced stuff for export, that is, agricultural goods. You know, think about the way economic system will work. There are going to be more people involved in manufacturing or in trade than in farming by its very nature. So he wanted to protect the tobacco planters, so he wanted to have a 2/3 vote of Congress required to pass tariff laws as a way of protecting the folks who are buying stuff that's being imported. Delegates from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, which had essentially merchant communities involved in international trade, wanted to have tariff laws passed by a simple majority so that the people with the states which were involved in this, which would have more votes, would be able to protect their interests as well as the interests of the nation as a whole. They didn't want a minority, the tobacco planters, protecting their own interest at the expense of the majority's interest. Kind of a complicated argument about who should pass tariff laws. Should it be done by a simple majority or by a 2/3 vote? And believe it or not, it's an issue that's going to come back again with a vengeance in the 1830s. Now, at the same time that Mason is proposing this, Luther Martin, who is also, he's a delegate from Maryland, introduced a clause which would allow Congress to abolish the slave trade by 1800. Okay? And Mason, who had just argued for allowing or requiring a 2/3 vote to limit exports or imports, rose in support of this. And Mason, who was a slave owner, he owned about 200 slaves on his Virginia tobacco plantation, rose with an impassioned speech about the brutality of the slave trade. It was a crime against humanity. It was a brutal thing, and we should be on the record as opposing this execrable commerce in human beings. The delegates from Georgia and South Carolina, who typically, they supported Mason on let's require a 2/3 vote to tax imports and exports to regulate trade, because they exported rice and they imported manufactured goods. They needed to import slaves to work on the rice plantations, or so they said. And they said, we cannot support a constitution which limits our ability to import slaves, to engage in the international slave trade. Even if we personally thought this was a good thing, if we went home, our states would reject it out of hand. And they accused Mason and the Virginians and Luther Martin from Maryland. They said, the reason you want to prohibit us from buying slaves from Africa or the West Indies is you have too many slaves now. You want to force us to buy them from you rather than getting them directly from Africa. Very contentious issue here, where you have these two slave owners from Virginia and Maryland rising to condemn the international slave trade, and these delegates from Georgia and South Carolina saying we rely on the import of slaves. Incidentally, the colonies had cut off the slave trade in the early 1770s as a protest against the general British trade policies. And at this point, only Georgia and South Carolina were importing slaves. One delegate suggested that perhaps we should just say all of the state, no state will be able to import slaves except Georgia and South Carolina. And the guys from Georgia and South Carolina said they didn't like that because that implied they were importing slaves and they were being held up to the public odium as engaging in what they recognized was also an execrable commerce, but one upon which their economies depended. Anyway, these two seemingly unrelated issues, 2/3 vote for navigation acts and Congress's power to abolish the slave trade or prohibit the slave trade, were both referred to a committee. And on this committee, the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia struck a bargain with the delegates from New England, the states which were involved mainly in the carrying trade. The guys from Georgia and South Carolina said, we will allow a cutoff of the slave trade in 1808. That is, we'll accept that if if you allow us to continue importing slaves until 1808, they said, we will go along with a simple majority passing navigation acts. So we really want a 2/3 vote. but we'll accept a simple majority. In exchange, we get to keep importing slaves until 1808, so for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. So a very fine compromise between these delegates from Georgia and South Carolina and the delegates from New England who wanted a simple majority to pass navigation acts. Maybe they would have wanted cutting off the slave trade earlier. In fact, I don't think any of the New Englanders say anything about the slave trade, whether they think it's as bad as George Mason says it is or not. Anyway, the committee reports this compromise, and George Mason is outraged. He sees it as a corrupt bargain, and he becomes very angry. And in the last days of the convention, he stays. Other delegates had come and gone. Mason stays until the bitter end. And in the last days of the convention, Mason and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts push for a Bill of Rights. Mason is unhappy with this compromise. He's wary about the Constitution as a whole. And then he and Gerry rise to say, we really should have a Bill of Rights. It's now early September, and these guys have been at this since May, and they don't want to take up any more time coming up with a Bill of Rights. So Mason and Gerry's motion for a Bill of Rights is defeated rather soundly. And at this point, the Gouverneur Morris, who is on the Committee of Style, draws up what we know as the final version. It's 7 articles. There have been 23 articles. Now they're whittled down to 7 or combined into 7. And the final debate begins. George Mason announces, when they have this final version, that he cannot support the Constitution. He announces that he would sooner cut off his right hand than use it to sign the Constitution. He says there should be a second convention. Now that we've learned a lot this time, let's have another convention and draw up a better Constitution. One with a Bill of Rights, one where a simple majority will not be able to pass navigation acts, and also one where the slave trade won't be allowed to continue for 20 years. And what really gets Mason is what he sees as a corrupt bargain at the heart of this between people interested in trade, these New England Yankees, and these Georgians and South Carolinians who are bartering in human flesh. To Mason, this is immoral, and the whole thing is, we're on the road to ruin, essentially, he says. This government will commence in a moderate aristocracy. It is at present impossible to foresee whether it will, in its operation, produce a monarchy or a corrupt, oppressive aristocracy. It will probably vibrate some years between the two, then terminate in one or the other. James Madison wrote that Colonel Mason left Philadelphia in a very ill humor indeed. He also had a carriage accident on his way out of town, which didn't help things. But we'll hear more about Mason later tonight, in fact. Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts also announces he won't support the Constitution. He says there is a civil war impending in Massachusetts between supporters of democracy, which is the worst of all political evils. I keep waiting for another politician bold enough to get up and say that. How about you when you run for office? Okay, good. The worst of all, and their opponents, who are as violent in the opposite extreme. And he knew that in Massachusetts, you'll recall, the year had opened with a civil war between these two factions, and this Constitution is just going to exacerbate this fight between the proponents of democracy and the opponents of democracy. And then finally, Governor Edward Randolph of Virginia, you'll recall he had introduced the Virginia Plan, announces he won't support this either. The plan, he said, gives Congress too much power. He can't go along with it. Now, Randolph is, well, it shouldn't shock anyone. He's governor of Virginia. He's a politician. And he wants to see how people in Virginia feel about it before he commits himself too much. He doesn't want to go home supporting a plan that is unpopular there. Bad thing to do if you are hoping to be reelected, Okay? And so he joins Mason and Gary in calling for a second convention. This kind of hurts Franklin's feelings. Franklin had a beautiful speech prepared calling for unanimity and so on, and here he has these guys getting up saying, we're not going to vote for this. We can't support it. We can't sign it. So at the end, 39 delegates, you'll recall that about 55 had shown up. Now 39 sign it from 12 states. And as they're signing it, Franklin looks at the president's chair. This is one of the great moments in our history. And he says to whomever happens to be sitting there, he knows the person sitting there is James Madison, who's writing down everything he says. He notices that on the back of the president's chair, there is half of a sun. The painters, he said, could not distinguish between a rising and a setting sun. I have, often and often in the course of this session, the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. So the delegates agreed to send the Constitution out to the states for ratification. They adjourned, and then the real debate began. September 17th, incidentally, is the day the Constitution is sent out, and fairly recently it was designated to be Constitution Day. One day is, I suppose, just as important. It's an important thing to remember. Okay, but the real debate begins. And as I think I pointed out last time, James Madison said, if you really are interested in what the Constitution meant to the people who ratified it, don't look at what was said in the Philadelphia Convention. Look at each state ratifying debate. Because this is the first national political debate. You'll recall in 1776, Congress, meeting in secret, had come up with the Declaration of Independence and then had generated popular support for it. The Constitution had been drafted in secret, and now the decision for ratification is a public one, with a public debate in each state, with each state except Rhode Island, calling for a ratifying convention. We have a debate within these conventions. We also have debates within the legislatures about whether or not to call a convention. And then we also have a debate in the newspapers. And the newspaper debate is carried, something that someone writes in Philadelphia will be reprinted in New York and Charleston, South Carolina, and Boston. So you have the emergence of national political alliances over ratifying the Constitution. So even had the Constitution been rejected, and I think if I were putting money on it in 1787, I would have said it was going to be rejected, you still would have had these national coalitions formed. And we don't know. If a vote had been taken immediately after the Constitution was presented, would it have prevailed? Probably not. It's a very interesting, I'm not going to tell you it's an interesting story. You're going to hear what an interesting story it is, because happily that's exactly what I was going to talk about tonight. So, on the one side, essentially, we had the supporters of the Constitution, the nationalists, Hamilton, Madison, Gouverneur Morris, Washington, who had been proponents of changing the system. Okay? Then Continental Army officers. Historians have been trying to figure out who was on each side for quite a while. And there are some similarities you find among these different groups. Okay, so nationalist side, we have the leaders, Madison, Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, James Wilson. We'll talk more about them in a bit. Guys who had been officers in the Continental Army tend to support ratifying the Constitution. Guys who had been officers in state militias tend to oppose it. Okay? Merchants, particularly merchants involved in international trade, are supporters of ratifying the Constitution, as are tradesmen, that is, mechanics, artisans living in urban areas, because they're also tied in with international trade. They realize the ineffectiveness of the Confederation. Trade is pretty much at a standstill because there isn't a government that can protect trade, so they need a government that can do the things you need in order to have a prosperous international trade. And also speculators in the paper notes and currencies we talked about a few weeks ago. Even though, there was a line of argument, the early 20th century historian Charles Beard said, essentially, what are these speculators in paper money who are behind ratifying the Constitution, and this is a scam by a bunch of rich guys to get the rest of us to pay off their debts. Not necessarily true. Elbridge Gerry was one of the biggest speculators in paper currency, and he's one of the most ardent opponents of ratifying the Constitution. So there. But yes, there are more speculators in paper currency on the side of ratifying than on the opposite side. So it's not a clear demarcation. Now, opponents of ratification tend to be members of state legislatures or people whose base of power is in one state. Most notable among them, George Clinton, governor of New York, Patrick Henry, governor of Virginia, and Samuel Adams, I think he's lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. And Adams wrote a letter to Richard Henry Lee, a member of Congress from Virginia and also an opponent of ratification. I confess, as I enter the building, I stumble at the threshold. I meet with a national government instead of a federal union of sovereign states. What does he mean by the threshold? What's the first thing you read when you read the Constitution? The preamble, and how does that begin? We, the people of the United States. Well, Adams says, who are they? He is a person in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a constitution, which is the fundamental law, which begins with a Declaration of Rights. How can you have we, the people of the United States? This convention was chosen by the states. It represented the states. The states, Samuel Adams knew, were the guardians of our liberties. You cannot have a government as distant as this one will be that will safeguard your liberties. He knew history. He knew what governments were like. They become removed from the people. They begin to trample on the people's rights. He had spent most of his life fighting against a distant government that did exactly that. Much as the British government professed to love liberty, it did trample on the rights of distant people like the folks in Massachusetts. So a federal union of sovereign states, you could have a stronger federal union, which Samuel Adams thought would be a good idea, but not an entity created by we, the people of the United States, because the liberties of individual people are going to be lost. So Samuel Adams and others oppose it, both for this ideological reason, not wanting a distant oppressive government, as well as for the reason their power within a state is going to be limited by this new government, which will eventually obliterate the states. Okay? Other folks who oppose ratification, as I said, officers in state militias, soldiers in state militias, farmers and debtors. The creditors tend to support ratifying because it's going to make sure debts are paid. If you owe money, you don't want this because it's going to make sure debts are paid. Okay? People on the frontiers tended to oppose it because they saw power being concentrated on the eastern seaboard. Remember, everyone at the convention had been someone from east of the mountains. Opponents of established churches, particularly Baptists and Presbyterians, oppose ratification because there is no protection for religious liberty here. Very important issue. Remember, the Baptists are still challenging established churches in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and so on. So you have, on the one hand, religious dissenters opposing the Constitution, and on the other hand, here in Massachusetts, there is a pretty strong opposition to the fact that the Constitution forbids any religious test for anyone holding office. That means that anyone, even someone says a Mohammedan or a papist, could become president of the United States. That was Mohammedan in the 18th century was a Muslim, a papist was a Catholic. So imagine that. So, so these different groups of folks tend to line up against ratifying. I think it's pretty clear what the reasons for ratifying it would have been at the time. You need a stronger government, the Confederation is ineffective, and so on. Essentially, there are two different general grounds for opposing ratification. I should say three. One, concentration of power in a distant government you will not be able to control. Okay? You go from that premise to looking at specific pieces of the Constitution, and you'll see things that will absolutely terrify you. Congress will be the sole judge of elections to Congress. That is, Congress will determine where elections for Congress will be held. So Congress can say, okay, the elections for representatives from Massachusetts will happen on the third Sunday of the month in Worcester between 7 and 9 in the morning. Okay? Congress could do that. Why wouldn't they? Wouldn't Congress just want to make sure only a certain number of people vote? Congress, according to the Constitution, says from time to time will publish its journals. Imagine that. From time to time. What does that mean? Whenever they feel like it. Now, here's something really quite astonishing. Let me see if I can find this. If you read it carefully, as I hope you all have, it's much shorter, incidentally, than the health care bill. Well, let me see. Congress also will provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. The militia is the state's defense. So Congress is also going to be able to create an army of its own. The state militias, Congress can say, will be armed with wooden sticks. And they also can determine where the militia will. They'll say, okay, the militia from Massachusetts, we're going to send to Georgia, or we're going to send somewhere else. Let's see. Congress will also exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may by cession of particular states become the seat of government of the United States. Congress will have exclusive jurisdiction over this 10-mile square district, which will become the refuge of every criminal in the country trying to get away from state laws. Okay? And also, Article 1, Section 8, which I mentioned as being very important, begins, and this is where you find this exclusive jurisdiction thing, the arming of the militia thing. It begins with Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, semicolon. Now, does that mean, and the comma there between imposts and excises and to pay the debts, does that mean Congress shall have the power to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States? Or does it mean Congress will have the power to lay and collect taxes for the purpose of providing for the common defense, general welfare? Does Congress have the power to provide for the general welfare of the United States? And if so, what power doesn't Congress have? And then this section ends with, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. All powers which shall be necessary and proper.